In the early 1980s, a family of cheap little machines landed in a bankrupt American city. Machines most professional musicians thought were a joke. They couldn't play a real melody. They sounded fake on purpose. Serious bands wanted nothing to do with them. And a handful of black teenagers in Detroit used those reject machines to invent the sound of the future. A sound that now fills warehouses on every continent on Earth. This is the origin of techno. Techno wasn't born in a nightclub. It was born in bedrooms and basements in a collapsing city, built by kids who had more imagination than money. Today, we trace the whole story. Where techno actually came from. Where the word itself came from. The three friends who built it. How they turned cheap machines and Motor City alienation into an entire identity. How the look and the ritual of the scene spread across the world. And how a music made by Black Detroit ended up conquering Berlin and then losing its own name. So how did the future get invented in the middle of a wasteland? To understand techno, you have to understand Detroit in the early 1980s, because techno is, above everything, the sound of that specific place at that specific moment. For decades, Detroit had been the Motor City, the beating heart of the American car industry, a place where a factory job could build a middle-class life. And then that engine died. Plants closed. Work vanished. The population drained out of the city, leaving whole blocks empty. By the early 1980s, unemployment in the city was catastrophic, and for a generation of young people growing up there, the promise of the industrial city was already a ghost. But here's the twist that makes techno make sense. The young people inventing it weren't the poorest kids in the ruins. Many came from black middle-class families in the suburbs. Kids who wore expensive European clothes, read style magazines, and dreamed of a sleeker, more futuristic world than the one falling apart around them. They were often college-bound, entrepreneurial, and intellectual, reading futurist paperbacks and taping European synth records off late-night radio. Techno wasn't the sound of the factory. It was the sound of kids imagining what came after the factory. The ruined city wasn't the thing they were describing. It was the thing they were trying to escape into the future through the machines. Their imagination was fed from a strange distance by Europe. Over the airwaves came the music of Kraftwerk, the German group who made cold, precise, beautiful electronic music built around machines and the idea of the man-machine. To a Detroit teenager, Kraftwerk sounded like the future arriving from somewhere cleaner and stranger. And this was not a small influence. It was foundational. These kids studied Kraftwerk records the way other people studied scripture. Later, Derek May would sum the whole genre up as George Clinton and Kraftwerk stuck in an elevator with only a sequencer to keep them company. Sit with that image, because it is perfect. Black American funk and German machine music, trapped together, forced to make something neither could have made alone. That collision is techno in a single sentence. There was also a local prophet on the radio, a DJ known as the Electrifying Mojo, whose real name was Charles Johnson, hosted a show called the Midnight Funk Association, and he played whatever he wanted across the color lines that usually divided American radio. Kraftwerk next to Parliament. Prince next to European synth pop. Devo next to Giorgio Moroder. He taught a generation of Detroit kids that machines and funk belong together, that a robot could have soul. If you want a single person who wired the two halves of techno's brain together before anyone made a record, it was Mojo, on the radio, in the middle of the night. There was also the dance side of it. In Detroit, high school kids threw remarkably sophisticated parties, organized by social clubs with names and reputations, competing over who had the most exclusive imported records and the most refined taste. Kids dressed sharply, printed flyers, and chased the rarest European singles. This was a scene obsessed with the new, the rare, the futuristic. A whole youth culture built around discovering tomorrow's sound first, before there was even a name for the music they were about to make. So the ingredients were all in place. A ruined industrial city, middle-class black kids hungry for the future, European machine music on the radio, a visionary DJ blurring every line, and a party culture that prized the cutting edge above everything. What was missing was the machines. And by the early 1980s, they were about to become cheap enough for a teenager to afford. So, where does the word techno actually come from? Like most origin stories on this channel, it's a little contested, but this one has a cleaner answer than most. The word had drifted around futurist writing for years. The author Alvin Toffler, in his books about the future, used terms like techno-rebels, people who would use technology to break free rather than be crushed by it. And that language was directly in these kids' hands, because Atkins has said they studied Toffler's Future Shock in a high school class called Future Studies. The name of the genre came out of a school textbook about the future. The coinage goes to Juan Atkins, one of our founders. He'd been recording as Cybertron, steeped in that futurist vocabulary, and he used the word as early as 1984 in a Cybertron track called Techno City. So the word already existed in his world. What fixed it as the name of a genre came later, and here's the part most people get wrong. In 1988, a British A&R man named Neil Rushton came to Detroit to compile an album of this new sound for the wider world. The working title was The House Sound of Detroit, because to British ears this was just Detroit's version of Chicago house. Atkins objected. He said, "This isn't house, this is techno." He delivered a track called Techno Music for the compilation, and the album was renamed Techno, the New Dance Sound of Detroit. That compilation crystallized the term. Notice two things there. First, the honest one. A Black Detroit art form was named on a record, but it was packaged and exported to the world by a British label, which is a small early preview of a much bigger story we will get to. Second, notice the difference from grunge. Grunge started as an insult meaning dirty. Techno started as a boast, a word about technology, the future, and control of the machine. The name tells you the values. One scene was proud to sound like mud. This one was proud to sound like tomorrow. Whatever you call it, the people who built it were three friends from the same suburb. Let's meet them. Every scene needs its architects. Technos are usually called the Belleville Three, named for Belleville, the town outside Detroit where they met as teenagers. Three black kids, bonding over records and the radio, imagining a future none of the adults around them could see. Atkins has told a lovely detail about how they met. Belleville High was only about 10% black, so the black kids all sat together at lunch, and that's how the friendship formed. Out of a school cafeteria came an entire genre. Enter Juan Atkins. He's the one most people call the godfather of techno, and for once the title fits. Atkins was the theorist, the one who took the futurist ideas, man and machine, the coming techno world, and turned them into actual records. Recording as Cybertron and then as Model 500, he built the template. Cold machine rhythms with a deep funk underneath. His 1985 track, No UFOs, released as Model 500, is now widely considered the first true techno record. If techno has a single origin point in one person's imagination, it's him. And he was barely out of his teens when he made the records that started it. Enter Derek May. If Atkins was the theorist, May was the poet. His most famous track, Strings of Life, released in 1987 under the name Rhythm is Rhythm, is one of the most beloved pieces of dance music ever made. All cascading piano and euphoria and yearning. A song with no conventional structure that somehow became an anthem on dance floors around the world. It's the emotional proof of the whole project. That these cold machines, in the right hands, could make something that reduced a room full of strangers to tears. Enter Kevin Saunderson. Saunderson was the one who found the groove that would reach the widest audience. Through his project Inner City and tracks like Big Fun and Good Life, he pushed the Detroit sound towards something warmer, more soulful, more song-like. Techno you could love even if you'd never set foot in a warehouse. Music with actual hooks and a human voice on top. Here's a detail that tells you how close the whole thing ran to never happening. Big Fun was almost left off that 1988 compilation entirely. It made it on at the last minute and then became the biggest crossover hit of the record, the track that broke Detroit techno internationally. Three friends, three roles. The architect, the poet, the populist. Together, they mapped almost the entire territory techno would explore for the next 40 years. But here I have to add the honest footnote because the Belleville Three is a tidy story, and tidy stories flatten things. These three were the crucial nucleus, but they didn't work in a vacuum. There was a wider circle of Detroit artists around them. Eddie Fowlkes, Blake Baxter, and soon a fierce second wave like Jeff Mills and Underground Resistance. Some of them get written out when the legend gets simplified into three names. And the line between what these Detroit pioneers were doing and what was happening in parallel in Chicago with house music was blurry and constantly cross-pollinating. The clean Three Founders version is useful shorthand. Real history is always messier than shorthand, and none of it would have gone far without the machines. Because these kids had ambition and vision, but almost no money. What they needed was gear cheap enough to fail on. Let's finally talk about the devices, because this is the heart of the story. In 1980, the Roland Corporation released a drum machine called the TR-808. It was designed to help musicians make demos by faking the sound of a real drummer. And by that standard, it failed. It didn't sound like real drums at all. It sounded like a machine pretending. Booming synthetic bass, hissing electronic snares, that hollow hand clap. Professional producers turned their noses up. Roland discontinued it after about 3 years, and unsold units ended up dumped on the second-hand market cheap. For not much more than $100, a broke teenager could suddenly own one. And then Roland did it again. In 1983, they released the TR-808's successor, the TR-909, and it flopped too, for the same reason. Musicians still wanted something that sounded like real drums, and the 909 didn't. Roland built about 10,000 of them and gave up after a year, so the 909 followed the 808 straight onto the cheap secondhand shelf. And this is the machine that truly became the heartbeat of techno. That hard, punchy kick drum you hear in almost every techno record ever made is the 909. The failure that Roland couldn't sell became the single most important sound in the entire genre. Add the squelching TB-303 bass synth, another commercial flop that got repurposed into acid, and you have the whole strange truth of it. Techno was built almost entirely out of machines the market had rejected. And that failure is exactly the point. Because these machines didn't sound human. They sounded like the future. The very quality that embarrassed professional musicians was the quality Detroit kids fell in love with. They didn't want a fake drummer. They wanted a machine that sounded proudly, gloriously like a machine. This is the heart of techno's identity, and it's a genuinely radical idea. The imperfection is the point. Where rock prized the sweaty authenticity of humans playing instruments, techno found its soul in the opposite. In the precision and coldness of the machine, and in what a human could make that machine feel. These weren't tools for imitating real music. They became instruments in their own right, with their own vocabulary. And here's the final irony, the one that tells you everything. An original 909 today, the machine Roland practically gave away as a failure, sells for well over $3,000. And the identity that grew around this was, from the very start, about the future and about freedom. There was something quietly radical in the anonymity too. This was not music about a frontman's face or a rock star's swagger. It was often faceless by design. The artist hidden behind an alias, the focus on the track and the machine rather than the personality. In a culture obsessed with celebrity, techno offered a different deal. The music, the rhythm, the collective experience of the floor mattered more than any individual ego. For outsiders, kids who did not fit in Detroit and soon far beyond, that facelessness was an invitation. On the floor, in the dark, nobody cared who you were, what you earned, or where you came from. And that experience, hours of repetition, a relentless pulse, a room full of strangers moving as one, was closer to a collective trance than to entertainment. Repetition, which pop music usually fears, became techno's whole method. A groove locked in and slowly evolving over 8, 10, 12 minutes, designed not to be hummed but to be entered. The point was not the song. The point was the state it put you in, and the people you shared it with. Now the look, because techno's relationship with style is different from a guitar scene's, and it starts before the music even had a name. Remember, the Belleville kids were sharp dressers from the beginning. This was a scene rooted partly in Detroit's style-obsessed party culture, where European designer clothes and a refined, futurist aesthetic were part of the whole point. Techno never had a scruffy phase. Its instinct was clean lines, forward-looking, a little severe. The visual version of the machine music itself. If grunge fashion said, "I don't care," techno fashion said something colder and more deliberate. I am beyond all that. When the sound crossed to Europe, that aesthetic sharpened into something iconic. Techno found its spiritual second home above all in Berlin, after the wall came down in 1989. A whole visual identity crystallized around it. The uniform went minimal, functional, and predominantly black. Industrial, utilitarian, stripped of decoration. And the spaces mattered as much as the clothes. Techno culture claimed the ruins of the industrial world and made them sacred. Abandoned factories, power plants, bunkers, warehouses. The literal architecture that had died in cities like Detroit was reborn as the cathedral of the scene. In Berlin, clubs opened inside former power stations and East German industrial buildings. Raw concrete, no decoration, spaces where the room itself felt like part of the machine. The setting was the statement. We will dance in the wreckage of the old world and build a new one out of it. Where a rock band needed a stage and a spotlight, techno needed darkness, concrete, and a sound system. The anti-stage. There was a deliberate rejection of spectacle in all of this. No pyrotechnics, no costumes, often no visible performer at all. Just a DJ in a booth, sometimes barely lit, and a crowd facing the music rather than a personality. The absence of glamour was the glamour. And did it leak into the mainstream? Absolutely, but in techno's own cold way. Over the decades, the aesthetic seeped outward. The minimalist black, the industrial spaces, the machine cool. High-fashion staged shows in warehouses and sent models down runways in techno-black utilitarian wear. The imagery of the rave, the machines, the lasers, the anonymous crowd, the fog-filled concrete room became a visual language that advertising and film rated again and again whenever they wanted to signal the future or the underground. Same pattern we have seen before on this channel, just colder. The mainstream took the surface and left the history behind. And that history matters here more than almost anywhere because of who got erased in the retelling. Because techno was never just sound and style, it carried an ideology. At its core, techno held a genuinely utopian idea that on the dance floor, in the dark, the divisions of the outside world could dissolve. Race, class, sexuality, background. The theory of the floor was that none of it applied once the machine took over and the crowd became one thing. And this wasn't naive escapism alone. For communities who were marginalized in daily life, a space with that promise was politically real. Techno, like house, was pioneered substantially by Black and often queer communities, and the dance floor was a place to be free that the rest of society didn't offer. A whole vocabulary grew up around it too. The DJ not as a jukebox, but as a guide taking the crowd on a journey. The set as a continuous, hours-long build rather than a string of songs. The near-sacred status of certain clubs and certain nights. Techno turned dancing into something closer to a ritual than entertainment. But here's the reckoning the scene still argues about, and we're not going to dodge it. Techno was invented by Black artists in Detroit. Yet, as it exploded globally, as it became the sound of Berlin and a billion-dollar festival industry, the story often got quietly rewritten. Techno got recategorized in many places as European, even German music. The faces on the magazine covers and the headline slots frequently didn't look like the faces of the people who invented it. The originators watched a music they built become a global phenomenon that sometimes forgot to mention their names. That's not a small footnote. It's arguably the central social story of techno. A Black American art form, born of a specific struggle in a specific city, becoming a worldwide culture that too often severed itself from its roots. Understanding techno means holding both things at once. The genuine, beautiful universalism of the dance floor and the real erasure that happened when the profits and the prestige moved elsewhere. The good news is that in recent years, that history has been fought back into the light. By writers, by the originators themselves, and by a scene increasingly insistent on remembering where the future was actually invented. So, what's left? Almost everything, honestly. Those reject machines, the 808 and the 909, went on to become two of the most influential instruments in the history of recorded music. The backbone not just of techno, but of hip-hop, house, and modern pop. Their sounds are in songs you've heard 1,000 times without knowing where they came from. The most mocked drum machines of the early 80s may be the most important electronic instruments ever made, and techno itself never stopped spreading. From Detroit basements to Berlin bunkers to festival stages on every continent, the sound those three friends built from cheap machines is now a global language. Every time a crowd stands in the dark and gives itself over to a relentless machine pulse, that's Belleville, echoing outward. Remember where we started. Cheap little machines that serious musicians thought were a joke. A bankrupt city everyone was leaving. A handful of black teenagers with more imagination than money. They took the things that sounded fake, the rejects, the failures, the machines, and they heard the future in them. And they were right. The device that changed everything cost about $100, and the people who understood it weren't the professionals. They were the outsiders, in the ruins, dreaming of tomorrow. That's techno. Built from failure, born in a wasteland, and still decades later, the sound of the future arriving. If you made it all the way here, you're exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And tell me in the comments, which Detroit or Berlin artist deserves their own full episode? I read them all. Get in there and make your case. Next time on Tape Hiss, we stay with the machines, but we move to Chicago. To a hidden warehouse where a different scene was being born at almost the same moment. The birthplace of house. Until then, keep listening to Tape Hiss.